What's going on, guys? Welcome back to WWE Network and Show, where I, Graham G.S. and Matthews, break down all the original content I watch on the WWE Network, on Peacock, and on Vice. As today we're talking episode 3 of Who Killed WCW, this one being called New Blood. So it's part of the 4-part series airing last Tuesday. Didn't get a chance to watch until just yesterday, actually. Another very entertaining episode. And again, as I've said in the other 2 reviews, and will probably be the case in the 4th review as well next week, there is nothing really all that new that you learn from watching this show. It's a very enjoyable show to see everyone blaming each other and not taking the blame or responsibility. There are people that kind of look back in retrospect and say, yeah, that probably wasn't all that great of an idea. There's some people that kind of stand by the stupidity that WCW was doing at the time. Again, you're not really learning anything new. But it has been a very enjoyable show so far, just to kind of relive the insanity and madness that WCW was experiencing during the height of its popularity in the late 90s and into the early 2000s. And to hear from people like Bischoff and Nash, Goldberg, Bret Hart especially, Vince Russo on this episode. We didn't really hear from him all that much, if at all, in the previous 2 episodes. This was when they bring in Vince Russo. So that's kind of where we start, too. So they open up the episode and discussing Eric Bischoff's departure from WCW in late 1999, where Vince Russo was brought in to replace Eric Bischoff as the head of creative. Russo kind of backtracks a little bit and talks about how he started freelancing for WWF Magazine in the early 1990s. And because the product was so bad, he said that he was kind of writing his own angles and own stories and stuff like that. Vince was so impressed, he called him up to his office and told him, I want to put you on creative. He was kind of tapped to be the new head writer with Ed Ferrara leaning into the late 90s. In the late 90s, he was the mid to late 90s, the new creative director of sorts for WWE. He said he was influenced a lot by what WCW was doing in the late 90s with NWO and stuff like that. What they were doing was real, and he brought that into WWF with the Attitude Era. So again, he's kind of credited with, to a certain extent, for all the faults that Vince Russo has. He is partially responsible for the success of the Attitude Era creatively anyway. And he doesn't really talk about that here, which was refreshing, because I've seen him say many, many times, I created the Attitude Era and WWF success. It was kind of implied here, but he didn't really boast about it as much as I thought he would. And the kind of analyst, I think it was Guy Evans actually, who co-wrote the WCW book many years ago, he mentioned how WWF during that period when Russo was the head writer tripled its revenue. But when it came time for SmackDown to come around in 1999, McMahon just expected Russo, and Ferrara as well, to do SmackDown for no additional pay. And Russo's talked about this before. I think this is a lot of what you hear on this episode, not only is already documented, elsewhere in other documentaries, they just talked about it on Vice last year in that Batch of the Beach 2000 episode with Hogan and Russo, and I don't think Hogan was on that episode. They just discussed Hogan, obviously. Jeff Jarrett was on that show, among other people. Booker T as well, I think. Maybe Booker T. I don't remember if he was on Dark Side of the Ring, but he is obviously interviewed here. I just remember them discussing how when Russo went to McMahon saying, listen, I've got kids, I've got a family, I can't continue to work this much, especially without additional pay. And McMahon just told him, well, hire a nanny. He didn't say that line here. I thought that was just so fucking funny because it's so cold and heartless and totally expected of Vince McMahon to say, but he didn't recite that line here. So immediately he went back to his office. He was on the verge of a breakdown, talked to his WCW connections, got in contact with them, and ended up working out a position for him over there. So he praised the talented mid-card, people like the Radicals, Eddie Guerrero, Chris Benoit, Perry Saturn, people that really weren't featured at the top of the card at all, but that were being underutilized by the, bigger brass of WCW because they were kind of focusing more on the main event guys. But around that point, he started to draw influence from the Jerry Springer show to incorporate more characters and shocking moments, who is the daddy type situations and shit. Also relied a lot on TNA Tits and Ass, not TNA the company, which he also would be responsible for, ironically enough, to bring fans in who weren't watching, because he knew he had the WCW wrestling fans, but he wanted to bring in an all-new audience, which to a certain extent I suppose he did for a while in WWF and maybe in WCW. But a lot of the storylines he was doing, he got to a point where they just weren't any fucking good. And the problem was, Kevin Sullivan said this, and I thought this was a great point, he had success in WWF because he had a buffer. He had a filter in Vince McMahon, and probably other creative geniuses there as well at that point, where they would tell him, hey, this is good, this isn't good, don't do this, do that, more of that sort of stuff. In WCW, he didn't really have any of that. He was just kind of allowed to do whatever he wanted, and all of his ideas made television, and a lot of which were just not very good, or were not tweaked, or were not fine-tuned. They were just on television, and they weren't really all that good. And they told him that they wanted him to be a part of a committee. And they were like, hey, listen, we want you to work as part of a greater creative committee. And Russo said, well, that's not in my contract, bro. Probably exactly that. That's not in my contract. I'm not doing that. I'm just going to go home and you're going to continue to pay me until you can figure out what to do with me, because you said in my contract I am the head creative writer. I don't answer to anyone. And they were like, okay. So he went home and he still got paid. In the meantime, Kevin Sullivan took over for creative. The Radicals, I guess, were mad that Russo wasn't there. Benoit ended up winning the World Heavyweight Championship, I guess, as a make-good to kind of convince him to stay. They left anyway. They immediately asked for their release and went to WWF within weeks. And it was right after that Bischoff was brought back. Bischoff was brought back to the company to work with Russo. Bischoff says that he was told to oversee Russo. Russo thought he was brought in to work with him. So Russo thinks that he was brought in to be an equal to Bischoff, or Bischoff was brought back to be an equal to him. Bischoff said, I would have never done that. I would have never agreed to have come back if I was an equal with Russo. I was always going to oversee what he was doing. And Brad Siegel goes, yeah, I don't really remember. I kind of have a sketchy memory when it comes to that. So he doesn't really give a clear-cut answer, because Bischoff says, yeah, Brad was the one who told me that. And Russo said, well, Brad never told me that. So Siegel says, yeah, I don't really remember, but that's what Bischoff says. That's probably what happens. It's basically what he implies here, saying that I'm not sure if Bischoff would have agreed to come back if that was the case, kind of reiterating what Bischoff had said. So they show Nash clips of what was going on in WCW at that point, like the blood dropping from the ceiling, the classic spot. We just saw it recently in AEW with Adam Copeland and Malachi Black and whatever, the whole Brood shit. They did it in WCW. The blood completely missed Kevin Nash. And he was like, this sort of shit at that point was happening all the time. That's how bad the company and the product was. That it was as shitty of a state as the company could have possibly been in at that point. And that's why that sort of stuff was happening. So they ended up booking an old guard versus new guard storyline, classic storyline based on reality with Hogan and those sort of guys, kind of telling the younger guys, because the idea was, in reality, these guys are getting older. They're not going to be here for much longer. So let's start building up some new stars. And Hogan says, and he even said this on television, and Booker T laughs because it's such a ridiculous line, that if I'm getting older, everyone else in the back is getting older too, brother. Like, basically, that's what he said in his promo on television, and that's what he actually believed. So they didn't even really bother to build them new stars, because Hogan thought he would be there forever and he would be on top and wasn't really doing anything to put other people over, because he had full creative control even at that point still. Russo did not think there would be as much politics as there was, and there was. I mean, there was a lot of politics going on behind the scenes. He didn't really expect that, which why wouldn't he have? They talk about doing the Ready to Rumble movie, which I actually want to watch one of these days. I have never actually seen that at all. Starring David Arquette, of course. But they mention that because to promote the movie, Tony Schiavone wasn't interviewed for this show, but they blame him, credit him with the idea, and he probably backs that up or has his own rebuttal for it, that it was his idea to put the World Heavyweight Championship on David Arquette. And they did it, and I guess Russo says everyone agreed to it. I guess including him, obviously, because they thought it would be a nice way to promote the movie. And they got a big negative reaction online, but Bischoff says, oh yeah, it would have only been temporary, it's not that big of a deal. And Arquette and Booker recall their backstage convo because they're both interviewed for the show, including Arquette, which is cool. Arquette goes, yeah, this is so awesome. Like, Booker, how many times have you won this championship? Like, genuinely asking, not trying to be like an asshole or something. And Booker goes, none. I've never won it before. And Arquette immediately was like, oh, fuck. Like, I should not be holding this thing. So Russo says it got a lot of mainstream attention, and that's why they did it. It worked out well. They were on the front page of the New York Post or USA Today or whatever it was the next day. But he also just doesn't give a fuck about the bad press, too, because they ask him, like, did that ever bother you? And he says no. Bischoff says he didn't stop it, didn't love the idea, but he also didn't really put a halt to it either. So at least he's being honest here, at least with that sort of stuff, at least on that front. And Russo says, I would do it again today, because of course he would. Arquette even in storyline wanted to give it up. So like a week later, he was like, yeah, I don't deserve it. People like DDP deserve it. And DDP was also interviewed for the show. He talks about how ridiculous it was. He couldn't believe it when they did it. He thought it was stupid. Booker T was asked, why did you think back then that you would never become World Heavyweight Champion? And he flat out says, because I'm black. I thought it was because that I was black that I would never be world champion. Ron Simmons, prior to that point in that same company, was world champion years earlier, but it was not a common thing for black wrestlers to become world champion in any company. Even in WWE, it wasn't until The Rock. I think The Rock was the first black WWE champion, and that was before this had happened. Rock was already the world champion by late 98, but still, it was not a very common thing, so that's really not that egregious for him to think that he would never be world champion for that reason. They recap how Hogan left after Bischoff left in 99. Brad Siegel asked Russo to take over creative 2 days before Bash 2000. That's what Russo says. He says Brad called him up and said, you're the new head creative writer going into Bash 2000. This was during the whole Bischoff-Russo regime. So Hogan still had creative control. He came back when Bischoff came back. And Russo changed plans where Hogan was supposed to walk out. He walked out after the whole fucking screw job thing with Jarrett. Hogan walked out. That was always the plan. Russo went out there when Bischoff and Hogan weren't there. And again, this was all discussed in more detail on that Dark Side of the Ring last year, doing a work shoot promo. I mean, he calls it a work promo. Everyone else says it was a shoot promo. Russo says the only thing that was real about the promo was his intensity and how pissed he was. But everything else was worked, and everyone else knew about it, is what he claims. But Hogan and Bischoff didn't find out about it until they landed from where they were flying from. They were on a plane when it happened. They flew from the arena. And then they found out when they left what Bischoff, or rather what Russo had done. So Russo basically went into business for himself with the promo. Booker claims he found out 10 minutes prior to the match with Jarrett that it would be for the World Heavyweight Championship. And he ended up winning it, obviously. And Russo says, the greatest thing I ever did as head of creative in any company was making Booker T, probably just in WCW, but the greatest thing I had done during my time there was making Booker the World Heavyweight Champion because he deserved it, which is true. Booker did deserve it, but the way that it kind of came about was a mess. Hogan and Bischoff couldn't believe it. They planned to sue. Russo was not sent home. Bischoff thought he would be. He thought Russo would be sent home. He was not. And Russo ended up taking over the creative committee when Bischoff left. So Russo, again in charge of creative, he wrote himself into the show, making himself the fucking world champion at one point. That was terrible. And he felt that he was better than 80% of the roster. He says that right now and today. He feels that as a character, he was better than 80% of the roster. So he put the belt on himself. He recalls the spot where he worked a match with, I forgot who it was, maybe DDP, I don't remember. Booker T, I think it was. And Russo got speared onto a metal barricade through a cage door by Goldberg. And he claims that he told Goldberg, do it on the stage, do it on the stage, do it on the stage. And he had a fucking helmet on too, a football helmet, but it didn't really matter. He told Goldberg right before the spot happened during the match, hey, I'm concussed, take it easy. Goldberg speared him anyway, he thinks. He thinks that he did it on purpose. Goldberg says, that's ridiculous. If I did do it on purpose, the guy would be dead. And it kind of laughs about it. So Goldberg doesn't give a fuck. So the last show that Russo was credited with writing was the October 2nd, 2000 episode. And he doesn't really go into why he left or how he got fired or what really went into that decision to kind of remove him from creative in late 2000. He just kind of says over and over, I hate the business. I hate the business. He says that today in his podcast and stuff. I hate the business, but doesn't stop him from talking about it, obviously. So that was it. So we really get into the true downfall of WCW, the very tail end of 2000 and early 2001, right before they closed their doors, on next week's series finale. Unless they do another, why would they do another fucking season? This is the entire downfall of WCW, but they're going to get into it next week. I look forward to that episode. Again, I reiterate, you will learn very little new information on the show. Everyone blaming each other is entertaining, and that's what the show is good for. It's very well produced. It's very quality. It's high quality television in terms of the way it's produced and showing clips and providing background and context. But as far as learning anything new, if you know about WCW and their history, it's documented in many other documentaries, and they kind of go into better detail about it as well. But this has also been a pretty good 4-part mini-series so far, and I've enjoyed it, and I look forward to checking out the series finale. Coming up on Tuesday, I'll probably watch it after the fact and review it here on the channel at some point next weekend, next Monday, whatever it's going to be. Thank you guys for checking out my review. I appreciate it. Be sure to check out all the other Who Killed WCW reviews here on the channel in the description box down below in that playlist. Be sure to like this video, drop a comment, share the video, and subscribe to the channel for more daily content. Have an awesome one, guys. I'm Graham G. Matthews, and I'll catch your ass down the road.